Good afternoon, everyone. Before I start, I'd just like to thank Mike for the invitation to talk here today. It's the first time in my career that I've been to a conference focusing mainly on human physiology, and I'm learning a tremendous amount just by listening to the talks. Now for something completely different, we're going to be talking about small mammals and birds in the context of heat tolerance. We can talk about their physiology and their ecology. The timing of this talk is really fortuitous because earlier this month, Blair Wolf at the University of New Mexico and I published this commissioned review in Physiology, one of the APS journals. And a lot of the material I'm going to be talking about today is covered in this review. And in fact, many of the figures I'm going to show you today come directly from this particular paper. So I'd refer all of you to this for more information on this topic. This is going to be a talk of three parts. I'm going to start out by talking about some of the patterns of variation we see in heat tolerance across birds and small mammals. I'm then going to move on to some of the mechanisms, the processes involved in heat dissipation that underlie some of this variation that we see, both in terms of maximum body temperatures that are tolerated and also in terms of maximum environmental temperatures. And then towards the end of the talk, I'm going to put this into the context of my major research theme, which is the ways in which climate change is going to affect animals living in hot environments such as deserts. This is one of my study sites in the Namib Desert of Southern Africa. The first point I want to make is that small mammals and birds are much less capable of defending a body temperature under extreme heat exposure compared to humans. It is very seldom that you'll hear a zoologist make a statement along the lines of humans are physiologically better than most species at doing something. But in this case, it is very much the case. The heat tolerance capacity that we have on account of these widely distributed eccrine sweat glands that under extreme conditions can produce up to 3 liters of sweat per hour just gives us a capacity for evaporative heat dissipation that is very likely unparalleled in the animal kingdom. In the case of small endotherms, if they have sweat glands at all, birds certainly don't have sweat glands, but the mammals that do have sweat glands generally have apocrine glands that are very patchily distributed, generally on foot pads and so forth. Panting is a vital avenue of heat dissipation for many small endotherms. In songbirds, panting is the primary avenue of heat dissipation. It's much less efficient than sweating or cutaneous evaporation, as we shall see. Another key feature of many of these animals that really needs to be taken into account to understand some of the challenges they face in terms of thermoregulation is the fact that many never drink. So something like this dune lark, which runs around the sand dunes of the Namib Desert, spends its entire life without drinking. All of its water intake is obtained from insects. Typically in warmer weather, you see a shift from seeds to insects for that reason. In the case of many bats, like this flying fox from Australia, there is no water intake by drinking during the hottest time of the day, which is of course when evaporative cooling demands are greatest. And then there are some exceptions like this elephant shrew, which belongs to the Afrotheria, which will occasionally drink. Now, just to illustrate how extreme this contrast in heat tolerance can be, there are a number of studies of which I'm sure you're all aware, spanning the 18th century to the 20th century, in which humans have been exposed to air temperatures in some cases exceeding 100 degrees Celsius. And we can tolerate those for brief periods. By stark contrast, this unfortunate creature, a shrew from North America, under resting conditions cannot handle 32 degrees for an hour. Exposure to 32 degrees for an hour is typically fatal for this particular species. So that's an extreme example, but I think it's an important perspective to keep in mind that we are far better than these small endotherms in terms of handling high temperatures. Now, one of the contexts in which we need to consider hyperthermic body temperatures in animals is this wide range of normothermic temperatures that Dominic introduced you to earlier today. And again, you have monotremes down here at about 30 degrees in terms of normothermic temperatures. And then you have passerine birds, which sometimes have modal daytime temperatures of 43 and a half. So around a 13-degree gradient in terms of normothermic body temperatures. Now, what may come as more of a surprise is to learn that there's a similar gradient in maximum body temperatures that these animals will tolerate. From about 37 degrees in a couple of nocturnal marsupials, right up to 47 degrees in one particular bird species, which I will talk about shortly. One of the groups that's quite interesting here is the bats, the mega bats, the fruit bats, generally have very modest heat tolerance. They don't handle temperatures much above 40, whereas the microbats get up to about 45 without breaking a sweat. In this case, literally, they don't have sweat glands. There are a couple of records from rodents, ground squirrels in the arid zone, the arid southwest of North America, of data logging studies where ground squirrels are sometimes getting up to above 45 degrees during their diurnal activities. Now, this particular record over here is from a study in the 1980s by Wes Weathers, somewhere in one of the University of California campuses. And he reported body temperatures of up to 47 in this bird, which occurs in tropical lowland habitats in Central America. And it's the highest body temperature record I know of in any bird species. Certainly the arid zone species that I've worked on generally don't get beyond above 46. So far we've talking about body temperatures. What about environmental temperatures? Over the last 6 or 7 years, I've been working with a couple of colleagues in North America and Australia, systematically pushing birds to the point where they're on the cusp of severe hyperthermia in order to establish what their tolerance limits are. And this is the kind of variation in environmental temperature that we see among birds of different body sizes. If you're wondering how we get this kind of stuff past animal ethics committees, what you need to keep in mind is that for a small, these are all desert birds, and for a small bird at an air temperature of 45 in full sunlight, the operative temperature is going to be close to 60 anyway. So we're actually not really exposing them to temperatures above what they would experience naturally in desert environments. And if you look at this graph, so again, data for about 56 species, I've just categorized them by orders. The first thing that might jump out at you is that there seems to be positive scaling with body mass. The second thing that'll jump out at you is that there's almost 16 degrees Celsius variation among species with similar body masses. And what I want to do is just highlight the three different groups involved here. So these are three orders of birds, the doves and the pigeons, the nightjars and the passerines. And they differ fundamentally in how they dissipate heat to the environment. Passerines rely very heavily on panting. It's a much less efficient mechanism than what some of these other groups do. Nightjars have this ability to have pronounced gular flutter, so they rapidly vibrate the gular region using their hyoid bone, and that provides a very effective way of dissipating heat in large quantities. They have a massive gape. They fly around at night catching insects, and they have this massive gape and this huge surface area inside their buccal cavities. Then the doves and the pigeons rely very heavily on cutaneous evaporation. So at high temperatures, about 80% of the heat that they're dissipating to the environment is occurring transcutaneously through mechanisms we'll talk about shortly. And it's really quite remarkable, even on a very hot day in the Kalahari Desert, where I spend a lot of time, these namaquadoves and so forth just don't pant or show any visible signs of heat stress because they can dump this heat across their skins. I also want to put these temperatures in the context of recent events. In June 2017, Phoenix Airport was shut down for the better part of a day when it hit 49 degrees Celsius, because it turns out many commercial aircraft cannot operate or are not certified to take off at those temperatures. In July last year, there were 4 consecutive days in Death Valley where the maximum temperature was 53 degrees Celsius. So the temperatures we're seeing in some of the world's really hot regions are approaching and sometimes exceeding the heat tolerance limits for many of these birds. I mean, 54 degrees is above the air temperatures that we know passerines can successfully defend a body temperature at. And this is kind of a trailer of what I'm going to talk about later in this talk when we switch to global warming. Okay, so That takes care of the patterns of variation we see, and you've seen how there can be massive variation between species in terms of maximum body temperatures during heat exposure and in terms of the maximum environmental temperatures that they can tolerate during heat exposure. I want to move on now to talk about some of the mechanisms underlying thermoregulation in birds at high temperatures. This is a figure that we designed with one of the artists for Physiology. I was quite happy with the finished product. And what it shows is the major avenues whereby birds dissipate heat during hot conditions. Panting is obviously a major mechanism of heat loss. And of course, in birds, you've got this network of air sacs surrounding the lungs that may or may not have some effect on the efficiency of panting. Many species have a circulatory structure behind the eye that acts as a brain cooling circuit. And you see gradients of anything from about 0.1 degrees Celsius up to 2 degrees between the brain and the core temperature. Obviously, the brain is cooler, and that's probably quite an important mechanism for birds that allow their body temperature to go up close to 45 degrees. At lower temperatures, when the air temperature is below body temperature, the avian beak is very important for non-evaporative heat loss. And so this is a thermal image of a hornbill, like toucans from South America. They've got fairly large beaks. This is a bird at about 30 degrees Celsius. The beak temperature is the same as background temperature, 35 degrees. This bird has vasodilated all the microvasculature in the beak. It's flushed that beak with body temperature, and that provides a heat radiator where it can offload heat to the environment without using water for evaporation. This cutaneous evaporation process that we've spoken about for doves and pigeons and occurs in other species as well. There's a lot of phenotypic flexibility there, and birds can adjust rates of cutaneous evaporation over timescales of seconds to minutes by means of microvascular adjustments, adjusting the blood pressure in those capillary networks under the skin, and then over longer timescales of weeks to months. We also see adjustments in the waterproofing of the skin. Birds alter the lipid composition of the stratum corneum and can either make their skins more or less waterproof depending on the environmental conditions in which they find themselves. There's this process of gular flutter that I'm going to talk more about. And then very important process for birds is facultative hyperthermia. Many species will show reversible regulated increases in body temperature up to about 45.5 during heat exposure. And unfortunately, we could think of no more imaginative way to illustrate that than this glowing babbler over here. This is just a brief summary of the distribution of these different avenues of heat loss. In birds, panting is widespread throughout the avian phylogeny. I'm not sure if there are any groups that don't pant. Cutaneous evaporation is really important in pigeons and doves and possibly other groups we haven't looked at yet. And then gular flutter is something that's widespread among the non-passerine, so birds other than songbirds. And it involves this rapid pulsation of the gular region via the hyoid apparatus. And it's in the nightjars where it really reaches its maximum efficiency because of the huge area of membrane involved. In mammals, panting appears to be absent in rodents. It's really pronounced in some other groups like your ungulates, your macropod marsupials, and cats. Sweat glands are absent in some taxa, including the bats. And in other groups, they're limited to very small areas of the skin. Saliva spreading is a very important avenue of heat loss in rodents. Many rodents will respond to high temperatures by wiping saliva all over their faces, sometimes their forelimbs. You also see this in things like kangaroos. There's some very famous thermal images of kangaroos that have covered their forearms in saliva, and the surface temperature there is far lower than the rest of the body surface. And then cutaneous evaporation obviously occurs in mammals. There's no such thing as a waterproof skin. But in bats, cutaneous evaporation across the wing membranes is thought to be a really important process during hot weather. Okay, now one of the consequences of this variation between groups of birds in terms of the primary avenue whereby they dissipate heat is that you see a lot of variation in terms of their capacity to handle high temperatures. What this graph shows for a couple of different avian orders, so there are songbirds over there, there's doves and pigeons and nightjars, is the maximum ratio of evaporative heat loss to metabolic heat production that they can achieve during acute heat exposure. So a value of 2 means that they are dissipating heat twice as fast as they are producing it through metabolic heat production, which of course is the fundamental basis for evaporative cooling. Most groups we've looked at so far, although our sample sizes are very small for some of these groups in terms of numbers of species, top out at about 2 to 2.5. All of the passerines we've looked at, 16 species, fall between about 1.2 and 2.2, 2.3. So none of them can dissipate heat more rapidly than about 230 times the rate of metabolic heat production. This is all from resting conditions. Sorry, I should have made that clear. This is all data for birds under resting conditions in the absence of activity. Then you get to your doves and your nightjars, and these birds are just weird. And they can get up to really high evaporative cooling efficiencies. So this species, the Namakwa dove from southern Africa, can dissipate heat up to about 4.7 times as fast as it's producing it during extreme heat exposure. Nightjars, one species, a rufous-cheeked, gets up to about 5.2. There's a lot of variation between species that seems to be correlated with the environments in which they roost. And so this is a species that roosts out in exposed sites on deep red sand. The operative temperatures there are often above 60 degrees for several hours a day. We've also recently recorded a value of 5.4 in sandgrouse. I haven't plotted that here, but that as it stands is the highest value we've seen so far in terms of evaporative cooling efficiency. On this side of the slide, I've put in a figure from our physiology review where what we've done is we've taken 2 bird species that both weigh exactly the same. They're both 50 grams, within 1 or 2 grams of each other. A thing called the chest-and-crown babbler from Australia and a rufous-cheeked nightjar from South Africa. These guys pant. It's their primary avenue of heat loss, and the nightjars, as we've already spoken about, use gula flutter. And what I've shown here as a function of air temperature is the relationship between air temperature and resting evaporative water loss rates, resting metabolic rates, and body temperature. And you can see the consequences of these different avenues of heat loss. In this figure, for example, you can see a completely different pattern here in terms of resting metabolic rate. Our songbird starts panting, and there's this clear upper critical limit of thermoneutrality, and then this large increase in metabolic rate at high temperatures as it has to pant to dissipate heat. The nightjars, the metabolic line is as flat as a pancake. And it's really quite remarkable that although you're seeing about a 2-degree increase in body temperature here, metabolic rate has got a Q10 of 1. And then the consequences of all of this, well, you can see it here in the relationship between evaporative water loss, much shallower increase in our nightjar, and in body temperature. Nightjars not letting their body temperatures go much above 42, whereas this passerine is hitting right up to 45. So profound consequences for heat tolerance arising from the major mechanism that these birds are using to dissipate heat. Now, the last part of the talk is going to focus on climate change. And I work primarily on deserts, and these are environments where the effects of climate change are very likely going to be very severe indeed. There are 2 patterns that we are seeing that are relevant to understanding how climate change is going to affect wild birds. The first is an increase in maximum air temperatures. I've shown you examples from the American Southwest. This is a forecast map that was published by the Australian Bureau of Meteorology on the 8th of January 2013. And its significance is that this was the first time they produced a forecast map where the forecast temperatures went up to 54 degrees Celsius. Until the 7th of January that year, this color bar topped out at 50. And ever since the 8th of January 2013, they have had to include temperatures up to 54, because on this particular day, they were forecasting temperatures up to 54 in South Australia. So increasing maximum temperatures. The second issue is more frequent exposure to hot days. So I know this text is way too small, but basically what I've done here for 3 sites across Australia is taken data for the last 50 or 60 years. So we've got 1960 through to 2010, And I've plotted the number of days per year on which maximum air temperature exceeded 40, simply because that's an approximation of average avian body temperature. And so the number of days per year on which birds are having to cope with conditions where air temperature is above body temperature is increasing rapidly, and we see the same pattern worldwide. We've learned in the last couple of years that the effects of high temperature on these desert birds can be thought of as representing a continuum of timescales. So over timescales of minutes to hours, you see lethal dehydration, you see lethal hyperthermia. By the way, these are not dead leaves, these are dead budgerigars. This is a photograph that was taken during a severe heat wave north of Perth in January 2009. And really what's happening here is simply that the environmental conditions that these budgies had to face simply exceeded their tolerance limits and their capacity to increase evaporative water loss to dissipate heat. We also see a host of effects over longer time scales. I'm not going to have time to go into that, but in many of the species, or all the species in fact that we've looked at so far, you find that on hot days approaching 40 degrees, birds cannot acquire enough food and energy, food and water from their environments to maintain body condition. And over longer timescales, there are a number of studies now based on museum collections showing this near universal response of decreasing body size. Birds, many other animals, are getting smaller as a consequence of climate change. I'm going to just focus for the last few minutes of this talk on these acute effects over here. And essentially, during extreme heat events, you can get mortality either if your environmental temperature exceeds your heat tolerance limits, or if your cumulative evaporative water losses exceed your dehydration tolerance limits. And in the last couple of decades, we've seen more and more media articles with headlines like this. We can model the risks of these effects quite easily, simply using air temperatures and using estimates of evaporative water loss from lab studies. So the ecology of many of these desert birds, on hot days, they respond to those high air temperatures by ceasing activity and sitting in the coolest microsite they can find in the landscape. Under those conditions, they are losing water by evaporation, they're not getting any water in. And so your cumulative evaporative water losses become something that you can model quite easily, and you can estimate how long it's going to take a bird of a given size in a given environment to reach its dehydration tolerance limit. We've been doing this now across several continents. So what we've done here for a particular North American species for which we have data, this is a thing called a cactus wren, is we've mapped its distribution within the US, and we've modeled the number of days per year on average when these cactus wrens are going to experience a meaningful risk of lethal dehydration. Under current conditions, those risks are low, maybe 2 or 3 days per year in some parts of its range. But fast forward to the end of the century, and in parts of Arizona and California, cactus wrens are going to be dealing with these conditions up to 60 to 70 days per year. In fact, they won't be dealing with these conditions because they won't be able to persist in these hot desert areas by the end of the century. So we're expecting huge biodiversity losses for these very hot deserts as a consequence of these lethal dehydration risks. We've subsequently run similar models for Southern Africa and for Australia. Southern Africa, very low risk. The species that we modeled, which has the highest risk, you're looking at maximum maybe 3 or 4 days per year. In Australia, this is for one particular species, the map looks similar, but the top end of this scale is 100 days, whereas over here it's 10 days. So the picture that's emerging at the moment at a global scale is that the risks of these lethal dehydration events are going to be very high in the American Southwest, very high in arid Australia, and certainly lower in Southern Africa. We still need to get into the deserts of the Middle East and North Africa and so forth. Okay, so there are the take-home messages. The first one is simply that birds and small mammals are not nearly as good as humans at coping with high temperatures. It's a very important perspective for us biologists when we understand how these animals are going to cope or not cope with climate change. You've seen as well how both normothermic and hyperthermic body temperatures can vary among groups by around 10 degrees, somewhat more in the case of normothermic temperatures. We've also seen how there's massive variation in the maximum environmental temperatures. that birds can tolerate and how that's functionally linked to the primary avenue that they use to dissipate heat. And in the last couple of slides, I've tried to show you how heat and dehydration tolerance limits of many of these animals are increasingly being exceeded as a consequence of rapid anthropogenic global heating. I'll finish off by thanking all the organizations that contributed to this work and thanking my wonderful team of collaborators and students. This was a photograph I took in July. We got everyone to the Namib Desert for a workshop, and we took this photo on one of the sand dunes on the last afternoon of the conference. And thank you.